The letter arrived on a morning when frost still clung to the edges of the autumn grass, brought by a young courier who apologized 3 times before he even handed it over, as though the water stains and faded ink were somehow his fault. Wendra Oakarm took the thin envelope with hands that had grown strong from 2 decades of farm work, her green fingers tracing the careful script of her name across the front. And she knew before she broke the seal that something about this delivery would crack open a place inside her chest that she had sealed shut long ago. The courier explained in a rush of nervous words that the old postmaster, Grenly, had died the week before, and in his final hours had confessed to his daughter about a bundle of letters he had hidden away after a fire 20 years past. Letters he had been too ashamed to deliver once he realized how much time had passed. Some had addresses too damaged to read. Others, like this one, had been perfectly preserved except for the watermarks that bled the edges of the paper into soft clouds of blue ink. Wendra stood in the doorway of the farmhouse she had shared with her late husband for 18 years before his passing, the place where she had raised 3 children who were now grown and scattered to their own lives, and she felt the weight of the envelope like a stone. She paid the courier without really seeing him, closed the door, and walked to the kitchen table where morning light pooled through the eastern window. Her reflection caught in the glass of a cabinet, and she saw herself as she was now at 42, her black hair threaded heavily with silver, her face lined but still strong-featured, her small tusks barely visible when her mouth was closed. She had been beautiful once, or so people had told her. She had been fierce and quick, and so full of hope that it had felt like madness. The letter opened easily, the seal long since weakened by water and time. The paper crackled as she unfolded it, and there in a handwriting she recognized instantly despite the years was a message that should have reached her when she was 22 years old, when the world had seemed poised on the edge of something magnificent. Wendra, the letter began, and she had to stop reading to press her palm flat against the table because her hands had started shaking. If you are reading this, then you know I have gone ahead to the old Greaves mill as we spoke about. I cannot stay in my father's house any longer, not with the way he speaks about you about us. I will not apologize for loving you. I will not pretend that what we have is anything less than everything I want for my life. She remembered the conversation now with a clarity that hurt. They had met in secret for months. A young human man from a respectable farming family and an orc woman whose parents had died when she was 16. Leaving her to scrape by on odd jobs and the charity of neighbors who tolerated her at best. Kellen Ashford had been 24, broad-shouldered and sun-browned, with gray eyes that looked at her like she was something precious rather than something to be feared or pitied. They had talked about leaving together, about finding a place where an orc and a human could build a life without the weight of suspicion and hatred pressing down on them. The Greaves mill had been abandoned for years, situated along the river at the edge of the district where the forests grew thick and wild. Kellen had said he could make it work, restore the mill, grind grain for the scattered homesteads out there. They could disappear into that green quiet and be happy. The letter continued in Kellen's firm, careful hand. I am leaving today, before my father can try to stop me. I have saved enough to buy the mill and the land around it. I have tools and seed and everything we need to start. Come to me when you are ready. I will wait as long as it takes. If it is a week, I will be there. If it is a month or a year, I will be there. I am not afraid of waiting for you, Wendra. You are worth every single day. The letter ended with directions to the mill, as though she might have forgotten, and a final line that made her throat close up tight. I love you. That has not changed and will not change. Kellen. Wendra set the letter down and stared at it until the words blurred. 20 years. 20 years. This letter had been sitting in a dead man's drawer while she had waited in the village, watching the roads, telling herself that Kellen must have changed his mind, that his father had convinced him after all, that she had been a fool to think a human man would truly give up everything for her. She had waited for 3 months, growing thinner and more hollow, until finally one of the other orc families passing through had offered to take her south with them to a settlement where she might find work. She had gone, numb and heartbroken, and had tried to forget. She had not forgotten. Not really. But she had moved forward, because that was what you did when the person you loved disappeared without a word. She had found work on a farm, met a widower named Torvin who needed help with his land and his young daughter. And when he had asked her to marry him, she had said yes, because he was kind and steady, and because she could not spend the rest of her life waiting for a ghost. They had built a decent life together. She had loved him in a way that was quieter and more practical than the wild, burning thing she had felt for Kellen, but it had been real. They had 3 children together before a fever took him 2 years ago, and she had grieved him honestly. Now she sat with a letter that rewrote everything she had believed about those early years, and she did not know what to do with the anger and sorrow and disbelief that tangled in her chest. The autumn morning stretched into afternoon as she read the letter again and again, memorizing the words, looking for some clue she might have missed. There was nothing but sincerity and hope, and it was unbearable. She finally folded the letter and tucked it into the pocket of her apron, then went outside to work in the garden because her hands needed something to do before she lost her mind entirely. Her nearest neighbor, a human woman named Petrus who had been friendly enough over the years, came by in the late afternoon with a basket of apples and stayed to talk while Wendra pulled weeds from around the squash plants. Petrus chattered about her son's upcoming wedding, about the early frost, about the price of grain, and Wendra made appropriate noises without really listening. When Petrus finally left, Wendra went back inside and sat at the table again, the letter in front of her like an accusation. She thought about Kellen Ashford, who had been so sure and so steady, and she wondered if he had waited at that mill like he had promised. She wondered if he had stayed for a week or a month before giving up, before deciding that she was not coming, that she had changed her mind. She wondered if he had moved on, married someone else, built a life that had nothing to do with the promises they had made to each other in the shadows of the village square. The wondering grew into a need that she could not ignore. By the time the sun set, she had made up her mind. She would go to the mill. She would see if it was even still standing. She would find out what had happened to the man who had said he would wait, and then perhaps she could put this ghost to rest and move on with the remainder of her life. She told her children nothing specific, only that she needed to travel for a few days to settle some old business. Her eldest, a daughter named Farah who had her father's blunt practicality, frowned and asked questions that Wendra deflected with vague reassurances. Her sons, twins named Jory and Micken, were absorbed in their own lives and barely looked up from their work when she mentioned leaving. None of them knew about Kellen. Torvin had known, because she had been honest with him from the start, but he had never pressed her for details, and she had never offered them. It had been a part of her past that seemed safely buried. Wendra packed lightly, just a small bag with a change of clothes and some food, and set out on foot the next morning. The Greaves Mill was a 2-day walk north, back toward the village where she had grown up, and she took her time, letting the rhythm of the road settle her thoughts. The countryside was beautiful in its autumn colors, the trees ablaze with red and gold, the fields harvested and waiting for winter. She passed farmsteads and small clusters of homes, and people stared at her the way they always stared at orcs traveling alone, with a mix of suspicion and unease. but no one bothered her. On the second day, the road narrowed and the forest closed in, and she began to recognize landmarks from her youth. The old stone bridge across the Fennel Creek, the lightning-struck oak that had been a meeting point for travelers, the hills rising in the distance, their tops already dusted with early snow. Her heart beat faster as she turned off the main road onto a smaller track that led toward the river, following the directions Kellen had written in his letter. The mill appeared through the trees like something out of a dream. It was larger than she had remembered, a solid two-story building of weathered wood and stone with a great wheel at its side, the river rushing past in a tumble of white water over smooth rocks. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and steady, and there were gardens around the building, well-tended plots that had been put to bed for the winter with neat rows of mulch and straw. Wendra stopped at the edge of the clearing and stared. Someone lived here. Someone had restored this place and made it into a home. Her mouth went dry, and for a moment she considered turning around and walking back the way she had come, because whatever she found inside that mill might be worse than not knowing. But she had not come all this way to be a coward. She crossed the clearing slowly, her boots crunching on the gravel, and climbed the steps to the front door. She raised her hand to knock and hesitated, her knuckles an inch from the wood, and then the door opened before she could make contact. The man standing in the doorway was older than the boy she had known, but she would have recognized him anywhere. Kellen Ashford had gone gray at the temples, his dark hair streaked with silver, and there were lines around his eyes and mouth that had not been there 20 years ago. But his eyes were still that same clear gray, and they went wide with shock when he saw her, his face draining of color. They stood frozen, staring at each other across the threshold, and Wendra realized distantly that she was crying, tears running hot down her cheeks, though she could not remember when she had started. Kellen made a sound that might have been her name, or might have been just a broken exhale, and then he reached out and took her hand, his fingers closing around hers with a grip that was almost painful in its intensity. He pulled her inside and shut the door, and they stood in the dim warmth of the mill's front room, still holding on to each other like they were drowning. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough and unsteady. "I thought you were dead. I thought something had happened to you, or that you had decided you did not want this after all, and I spent years trying to figure out which possibility was worse." Wendra shook her head, struggling to find words. "I never got your letter. It was lost. I only received it 2 days ago. I waited for you in the village for months, Kellen. I thought you had left me." His expression cracked into something raw and devastated. "No, God, no, I was here. I have been here the entire time." She stared at him, trying to process the enormity of what he was saying. "The entire time. 20 years. I restored the mill. I built up the business. I kept thinking you would come, that you were just delayed, that there was some reason you had not made it yet. After the first year, I started to lose hope, but I could not leave. What if you came and I was gone? What if you showed up and thought I had abandoned you?" He laughed, a bitter sound. "I drove myself half mad with it. My father died thinking I had lost my mind. My brother tried to convince me to come back, to move on, but I could not. This place, this mill, it was supposed to be ours. I could not let it go." Wendra felt her knees weaken, and Kellen must have seen it because he guided her to a chair near the fire, his hands gentle despite the tension in his shoulders. She sat down hard, her bag slipping from her shoulder to the floor, and pressed her hands to her face. A postmaster hid the letter. There was a fire, and he was too ashamed to admit he had lost track of some of the mail, so he just kept it hidden. He confessed on his deathbed. Kellen stood in front of her, his hands clenched at his sides. 20 years. We lost 20 years because of a coward who could not face his mistake. The anger in his voice was sharp and foreign, so different from the easygoing young man she had known, and Wendra looked up at him, seeing the ways that time and disappointment had changed him. He was still handsome, still strong, but there was a hardness around his edges now, a guardedness that had not been there before. She understood it. She had grown harder, too, in her own ways. "I married," she said, "because he needed to know. I waited for you for months, and when I heard nothing, I thought you had decided your father was right. I thought you had chosen your family over me. So I left the village and I met someone else and I married him." Kellen flinched, but he nodded slowly. "I heard eventually. One of the traveling merchants told me years ago that an orc woman matching your description had settled south of here with a human farmer. I told myself it was not you, or that if it was, you had chosen a better life than I could offer. I tried to be happy for you." "He died 2 years ago," Wendra said quietly. "Torvin. His name was Torvin. He was a good man. We had a good life together. I will not apologize for that. I would not ask you to." Kellen moved to sit in the chair across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I am glad you were not alone. I am glad you had someone." They fell into silence, the crackle of the fire the only sound. Wendra studied the room around her, taking in the details she had missed in her initial shock. The mill was cozy and well-kept, with sturdy furniture and shelves lined with books and jars of preserved food. There were small touches that spoke of care, embroidered cushions and woven rugs, and she wondered if he had done all of this himself, or if there was someone else in his life now. As though reading her thoughts, Kellen said, "I never married. People tried to match me with their daughters or sisters, but I could not bring myself to do it. It felt like a betrayal, even after years had passed, even when I was almost certain you were not coming. I suppose I am a fool." "Not a fool," Wendra said softly. "Just loyal. Too loyal, maybe." He looked at her with those steady gray eyes, and she saw the weight of all the years he had spent waiting, hoping, grieving. "Why did you come here now, Wendra? What do you want from me?" It was a fair question, and she did not have a simple answer. She had come because the letter had upended everything she thought she knew, because she had needed to see if he was real, if any of it had been real. But now that she was here, sitting across from the man she had loved with such ferocity 20 years ago, she did not know what she wanted. "I needed to know," she said finally. "I needed to understand what happened. I needed to see you. And now that you have seen me." She met his gaze, and the truth settled over her like a heavy cloak. She was falling for him again, or perhaps she had never stopped falling, and that terrified her. She had a life, children, responsibilities. She could not just append everything because of a letter that arrived 2 decades too late. But looking at Kellen, at the way his face had lit up when he first saw her despite the pain that followed, she knew that walking away again would break something in her that had only just started to heal. "I do not know," she admitted. "I do not know what I want." Kellen nodded slowly, and some of the tension eased from his shoulders. "Then stay for a few days. Let me show you what I have built here. Let us talk, at least, and figure out if there is anything left between us besides ghosts and regrets." It was a reasonable request, and Wendra found herself agreeing before she had fully thought it through. Kellen showed her to a small guest room on the 2nd floor of the mill, a tidy space with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the river. She set her bag down and stood at the window for a long time, watching the water rush past and the trees sway in the evening breeze. That night, they ate dinner together at a small table in the kitchen, a simple meal of bread and stew that Kellen had made himself. They talked carefully around the weight of the past, discussing instead the workings of the mill, the farmers who brought their grain to be ground, the rhythms of life in the isolated stretch of forest. Kellen told her about the gardens he had planted, rows of vegetables and herbs that he tended meticulously. And Wendra found herself smiling at the way his face lit up when he described the first year the apple trees he had grafted finally bore fruit. "I always thought you would like it here," he said at one point, his voice quiet. "I planted those gardens for you, for us. I thought about what you would want to grow, what you would need. I know that sounds absurd now, but at the time it made sense." Wendra felt her chest tighten. "It is not absurd, it is heartbreaking." He looked down at his bowl, his jaw working. "I am not sure I know how to let go of that heartbreak. It has been part of me for so long." She reached across the table and placed her hand over his, and he stilled at the contact, his eyes flicking up to meet hers. "We do not have to let go of it all at once," she said. "But maybe we can start by forgiving the things that were not our fault." He turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers, and they sat like that until the fire burned low and the night grew cold. Over the following days, Wendra settled into the rhythm of the mill. She helped Kellen with the work, grinding grain and hauling sacks, tending the gardens and preparing food. It was hard physical labor, but it was familiar, and she found a strange comfort in it. They talked while they worked, filling in the gaps of 20 years with stories and memories. Kellen told her about the early years at the mill, the struggles to get the wheel working properly, the slow process of building trust with the scattered farmers who needed his services. Wendra told him about her children, about Farah's fierce intelligence and Jory's quiet kindness and Mikken's terrible singing voice. She told him about Torvin, about the way he had never tried to change her or make her into something she was not, and Kellen listened without jealousy, only sadness for the time they had lost. One afternoon, they walked along the river, following a narrow path that wound through the trees. The air was crisp and clear, and the sunlight filtered through the remaining leaves in shafts of gold. Kellen pointed out landmarks, a beaver dam, a deep pool where trout gathered in the summer, and Wendra listened, drinking in the peace of the place. "I used to imagine us walking here together," Kellen said at one point, his hands shoved into his pockets. "I used to talk to you in my head, telling you about things I had seen or ideas I had for the mill. It probably sounds mad." "Not mad," Wendra said. "Lonely." He glanced at her, and she saw the truth of it in his eyes. He had been so lonely, waiting here in this beautiful, isolated place, and the realization made her ache. They stopped at a bend in the river where the water widened into a calm stretch, and Kellen picked up a smooth stone and skipped it across the surface. It bounced 3 times before sinking. Wendra found her own stone and tried, managing 4 skips, and Kellen laughed, the sound bright and surprised. "You always were better at this than me," he said. "I had a good teacher." She had, in fact, learned from an old orc man who had taken pity on her after her parents died, but she did not correct Kellen's assumption. The moment felt too fragile. They stood in silence for a while, watching the river, and then Kellen said, "I forgive you, you know, for marrying someone else. For building a life without me. I do not want you to carry guilt over that." Wendra turned to him, surprised. "I do not feel guilty. I made the best choice I could with the information I had." "Good." He hesitated, then added, "But I am still angry, not at you. At the postmaster, at the circumstances, at the universe for being so cruel. I do not know how to let that go." She understood. She felt the same anger, a simmering resentment that 2 lives had been derailed by one man's cowardice. But she also knew that holding on to that anger would poison whatever chance they might have to salvage something from the wreckage. "We will let it go together," she said. "Slowly, one day at a time." Kellen looked at her, and for the first time since she had arrived, she saw something like hope in his expression. "Do you think we can do that? Start over after all this time?" "I do not know," she admitted, "but I am willing to try if you are." He stepped closer, and she tilted her head back to look up at him. He was not much taller than her, perhaps 3 inches, and she liked that they were nearly eye to eye. He reached up and brushed a strand of hair back from her face, his touch gentle. "I never stopped loving you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I tried. God knows I tried, but it was always you, Wendra." Her throat closed up and she had to swallow hard before she could speak. "I love Torvin, I need you to know that. But what I felt for him was different from what I felt for you. You were the wild, burning thing. He was the steady flame. Both were real, but they were not the same." "I know." Kellen dropped his hand but did not step back. "And I am not asking you to pretend the last 20 years did not happen. I just want to know if there is still something here between us, if we can build something new." Wendra reached up and placed her hand against his chest, feeling the steady thud of his heartbeat under her palm. "I think there is," she said. "I think there has always been something here, even when we thought it was gone." He covered her hand with his own, and they stood like that, the river rushing past, the forest closing in around them, and Wendra felt a sense of rightness that she had not felt in years. This was where she was supposed to be. This was what she had been missing without even realizing it. When they walked back to the mill, Kellen took her hand, and she let him, their fingers laced together like they had been all those years ago. That night after dinner, they sat by the fire and Kellen pulled out a small wooden box from a shelf. He opened it carefully and lifted out a stack of papers, yellowed with age. Wendra leaned closer and saw that they were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to her. "I wrote to you," Kellen said quietly. "For years, I wrote letters even though I had no way to send them. It helped me feel less alone. I would tell you about my day, about the mill, about the things I was thinking. I never stopped talking to you, even when I thought I would never see you again." Wendra took the letters with shaking hands, her vision blurring. She opened the first one and read a few lines, seeing Kellen's familiar handwriting describing the first successful grinding of grain at the mill, the triumph and exhaustion he had felt. The next letter talked about planting the gardens, about how he had chosen beans because he remembered her mentioning that she liked them. Another described a harsh winter and his worry that the mill wheel would freeze. She read through several more, each one a window into the life he had built here, the hopes he had clung to, and by the time she set them down her face was wet with tears. "You never gave up," she said, her voice thick. "You really never gave up." "I could not." Kellen took the letters back and returned them to the box, handling them like they were precious. "Giving up would have meant accepting that it was all for nothing, that we were for nothing, and I could not do that." Wendra wiped her eyes and looked at him, this man who had shaped his entire life around a promise, and she felt something shift inside her. She had come here looking for answers, for closure, but what she had found was something far more complicated and far more valuable. She had found someone who had loved her so completely that even 20 years and a lost letter had not been enough to erase it. "I am not the same person I was," she said. "I am older, harder. I have responsibilities, children who depend on me. I cannot just walk away from all of that." "I am not asking you to." Kellen leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. "I am asking you to consider whether there is room in your life for this for us. I do not need an answer tonight or even next week, but I need to know that you are at least thinking about it." She nodded slowly. "I am thinking about it. I have not stopped thinking about it since I read your letter." They talked late into the night, discussing practicalities and possibilities. Wendra's children were grown, mostly independent, though Farah still lived nearby and relied on her for help with the grandchildren. Her sons had their own farms and families and barely needed her. The farm she lived on had been Torvin's, and while it was technically hers now, She had been considering selling it, as the work was becoming too much for her alone. She had not made any decisions yet, but the idea of leaving had been growing in her mind even before the letter arrived. Kellen listened without pushing, his hands folded on the table, and when she finally ran out of words he said, "Whatever you decide, I will respect it. But I want you to know that there is a place for you here if you want it. This mill, this life, it was always meant to be shared." Wendra stayed at the mill for 5 more days, and with each passing day she felt more certain of what she wanted. She helped Kellen with the work, learned the rhythms of the place, met a few of the farmers who brought their grain to be ground. They were polite to her, though she caught the curious glances and the whispered conversations. An orc woman at the mill with Kellen Ashford. It would be the subject of gossip for weeks, she was sure, but she found she did not care as much as she once might have. On her last morning, she woke early and went downstairs to find Kellen already up, standing at the window with a cup of tea in his hands. He turned when he heard her and offered a small smile. "I made extra if you want some." She poured herself a cup and joined him at the window, looking out at the gardens that were slowly going dormant for the winter. "I need to go home," she said. "I need to talk to my children, settle my affairs." "But I want to come back, Kellen. I want to try this." His face transformed, the guarded expression giving way to something open and joyful. "Are you sure?" "I am sure," she said, and realized as she spoke that it was true. She wanted this, wanted him, wanted the life they could build together even if it was 20 years late. She was tired of living in the shadow of what might have been. It was time to step into what could still be. Kellen set down his tea and pulled her into a hug, his arms wrapping around her tightly, and she held on to him, breathing in the scent of wood and grain and the faint tang of the river. They stood like that for a long time, neither of them speaking, and when they finally pulled apart, Wendra felt lighter than she had in years. She left that afternoon, promising to return within a month, and Kellen walked her to the edge of the clearing, his hand warm in hers. "I will be here," he said, echoing the words from his letter. "I will wait as long as it takes." "You will not have to wait long," she promised, and then she turned and walked back toward the road, glancing over her shoulder once to see him standing there, watching her go. The journey home felt both longer and shorter than the journey out. Wendra's mind raced with plans and possibilities, with the conversation she would need to have with her children, with the practicalities of selling the farm and moving her life north. It was overwhelming, but it was also exhilarating. When she reached her farmhouse, she found Farah waiting on the porch, her arms crossed and her expression concerned. "Where have you been, Mother? You said a few days, and it has been over a week." Wendra climbed the steps and set down her bag, meeting her daughter's eyes. "I went to see someone, an old friend, someone I knew before I met your father." Farah's frown deepened. "What kind of friend?" "The kind I should have ended up with if life had gone differently." Wendra gestured toward the door. "Come inside. We need to talk." They sat at the kitchen table, and Wendra told her daughter the whole story, starting with Kellen and their plans to leave together, the letter that never arrived, the years of waiting and grief and moving on. She told her about Torvin, about how she had loved him truly but differently, and then about receiving the letter and traveling to the mill and finding that Kellen had never left. Farah listened in silence, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to something softer and sadder. "So you are going to leave," Farah said when Wendra finished. "You are going to go live with this man at his mill." "I am," Wendra said. "I know it sounds sudden, and I know it must be strange to hear about this now, but this is something I need to do. Your father knew about Kellen. He understood that there was a part of me that never fully healed from losing him. I think he would understand this too." Farah looked down at her hands, her jaw tight. "I do not like it. I do not like that you are running off after some man you have not seen in 20 years. What if he is not who you remember? What if this is a mistake? It might be, Wendra admitted. But it is my mistake to make. I am not a young woman anymore, Farah. I do not have decades stretching ahead of me. If I want to take this chance, I need to take it now. Her daughter was quiet for a long moment, and then she sighed, the tension draining from her shoulders. I suppose I cannot stop you, but I do not have to like it. You do not, Wendra agreed, but I hope eventually you will understand. The conversation with her sons went similarly, though they were less openly resistant. Jory seemed bemused by the whole thing, shaking his head and muttering about how his mother was braver than he would ever be. Micken asked practical questions about the mill and the land, and whether Wendra would need help moving, and she was grateful for his straightforwardness. Selling the farm took longer than she had hoped, nearly 2 months of negotiations and paperwork. But by the time the first snows began to fall, Wendra had settled her affairs and packed up the belongings she wanted to keep. Farah remained distant, polite but cool, and it hurt, but Wendra told herself that time would soften her daughter's disapproval. She hoped it would anyway. On the day she was set to leave, Jory and Micken came to help her load a wagon with her things, and Farah arrived just as they were finishing, her face tight. She stood at the edge of the yard, her arms wrapped around herself, and Wendra walked over to her slowly. I wish you would stay, Farah said, her voice low. I wish you would choose us. I am not choosing him over you, Wendra said gently. I am choosing a life for myself. You have your own family, your own home. Jory and Micken have theirs. I am proud of all of you, but I need something for myself now. Can you understand that? Farah's eyes filled with tears and she looked away, blinking hard. I suppose I have to. Wendra pulled her daughter into a hug, holding her tightly despite Farah's initial stiffness. I love you. That will not change no matter where I am. Farah nodded against her shoulder, and when they pulled apart her expression was a little softer. Be happy then. If you are going to do this, at least be happy. I will, Wendra promised. The journey back to the mill was cold and slow, the roads icy and the wagon heavy, but Wendra did not mind. She traveled with a sense of purpose, of rightness, and when the mill finally came into view through the trees, her heart lifted. Smoke rose from the chimney, and there was a lantern burning in the window. And as she pulled the wagon into the clearing, Kellen emerged from the door, his face breaking into a wide, unguarded smile. He helped her unload the wagon, carrying boxes and furniture up into the mill, and when everything was inside, he pulled her close and kissed her forehead. Welcome home, he said, and Wendra realized with a start that it was true. This place, this man, they were her home now. They settled into a life together with surprising ease. Wendra had worried that 20 years apart would make them strangers, that the people they had become would no longer fit together. But instead, they found that they complemented each other in ways they had not even anticipated. Kellen was meticulous and patient, content to spend hours fine-tuning the mill's mechanisms or planning next year's gardens. Wendra was practical and decisive, quick to identify problems and find solutions. Together they ran the mill efficiently, and the business thrived. The winter was harsh, but they had each other, and the mill was warm and well-stocked. They spent the long evenings by the fire, reading or talking or simply sitting in companionable silence. Kellen taught Wendra the finer points of running the mill, and she taught him some of the preservation techniques she had learned over the years. They cooked together, experimented with recipes, laughed at each other's mistakes. There were difficult moments, too. Kellen had nightmares sometimes, waking in the dark with a gasp, and Wendra would hold him until the tension eased from his body. He told her once that he dreamed of waiting, of standing at the edge of the clearing and watching the road for a figure that never came, and she understood the weight of that. She had her own moments of doubt, times when she wondered if she had been selfish to leave her children, if she should have stayed and accepted the quiet loneliness of widowhood. But those moments passed, and the certainty that she had made the right choice remained. Spring came slowly, the snow melting to reveal the gardens beneath, and Wendra threw herself into the work of preparing the soil and planting seeds. Kellen worked beside her, his hands steady and sure, and they talked about what they would grow, what they would preserve, what they would trade. It felt like building something real, something permanent, and Wendra found a deep satisfaction in it. One afternoon in late spring, a visitor arrived at the mill, a young woman with an infant in her arms and a desperate look in her eyes. She introduced herself as Maris, and she explained in a rush that she was a distant relative of Kellen's, the daughter of a cousin who had passed away the year before. She had been traveling to find work when her husband fell ill and died, leaving her alone with the baby. She had nowhere else to go. Kellen and Wendra exchanged a glance, and then Wendra stepped forward and took the baby gently from Maris's arms. The child was tiny, no more than a few months old, with a shock of dark hair and wide, curious eyes. "You are welcome here," Wendra said. "Both of you, stay as long as you need." Maris stayed for a week, recovering her strength and her composure, and when she left she pressed Wendra's hand and thanked her with tears in her eyes. But before she went, she made a quiet request. Her baby, a girl, was too much for her to care for alone while she tried to find work and rebuild her life. She asked if Wendra and Kellen would consider taking the child, raising her as their own, just until Maris could get back on her feet. It was meant to be temporary, but Wendra saw the exhaustion in the young woman's eyes, the desperation, and she knew that temporary might become permanent. Kellen and Wendra talked about it long into the night, sitting at the kitchen table with the baby asleep in a makeshift cradle nearby. It was a huge responsibility, raising a child at their age, but it also felt right, like the final piece of the life they were building together. "We can do this," Kellen said finally, "if you want to." Wendra looked at the baby, at the tiny perfect face, and felt something settle in her chest. "I want to." They named the baby Meryl, and she became theirs in all the ways that mattered. Maris sent letters occasionally, promising to return when she could, but the months stretched on and the promises faded. Wendra did not mind. She loved Meryl fiercely, with the same intensity she had loved her own children, and Kellen was a doting, gentle father. They adjusted their routines to accommodate the baby, taking turns with feedings and diaper changes, soothing her through the fussy nights. Wendra wrote to her children, telling them about Meryl, and she received a cautious but warm letter back from Jory, congratulating her and promising to visit in the summer. Micken sent a package of baby clothes his own children had outgrown, and even Farah sent a short note, wishing her well. It was not a full reconciliation, but it was a start. As Meryl grew, the mill became a place of laughter and joy. The baby's first smile, her first wobbly steps, her first words, all of it filled the space with life in a way it had not had before. Farmers who came to the mill remarked on how happy Kellen seemed, how the stern, solitary man they had known had softened into someone warm and approachable. They were kind to Wendra too, and if they gossiped about the orc woman and the human man and their strange little family, they did it quietly and without malice. One summer evening, when Meryl was nearly a year old, Wendra sat on the porch of the mill with the baby in her lap, watching the sun set over the river. Kellen came out to join her, sitting down on the steps with a contented sigh. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Kellen said, I have been thinking. About what? Wendra asked, bouncing Meryl gently as the baby grabbed at her hair. About us. About making this official. He glanced at her, a little nervous. I know we are old and practical and we have already built a life together, but I would like to marry you, Wendra, properly, if you will have me. Wendra felt a smile spread across her face, wide and unguarded. I would like that. Kellen reached into his pocket and pulled out a small ring, simple and silver, and slipped it onto her finger. I have had this for 20 years, he said quietly. I bought it the week before I wrote you that letter. I have been carrying it around ever since. She looked down at the ring, at the way it caught the fading light, and felt tears prick her eyes. You really are a fool, she said, her voice thick. A fool for you, he agreed and leaned over to kiss her. They were married a month later, in a small ceremony at the mill with only a handful of guests. Jory and Micken came with their families, and even Farah made the journey, bringing her children and a cautious smile. A local priest officiated, and Wendra wore a simple blue dress that Kellen had bought for her in town. They exchanged vows by the river, with Meryl babbling happily in Jory's arms, and when the priest pronounced them, married Kellen kissed Wendra like they were young again, like they had all the time in the world. The celebration afterward was lively and joyful, with food and music and laughter that echoed through the clearing. Farah approached Wendra as the sun was setting, her expression tentative. I am glad you are happy, mother, she said. I did not understand before, but I think I do now. You deserve this. Wendra hugged her daughter tightly, relief and gratitude flooding through her. Thank you, she whispered. That means everything to me. As the guests began to leave and the night grew quiet, Kellen and Wendra stood together at the edge of the garden, looking out at the life they had built. Meryl was asleep inside, tucked into her cradle, and the mill stood solid and warm behind them. We did it, Kellen said, his arm around Wendra's shoulders. We lost 20 years, but we did not lose each other. Wendra leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her side. No, she agreed. We did not. They stood there for a long time, the river rushing past and the stars beginning to appear overhead, and Wendra thought about the letter that had arrived 20 years too late, the words that had changed everything. She thought about the life she had lived in the interim, the love she had found with Torvin, the children she had raised. She thought about Kellen, waiting at the mill year after year, tending gardens that were meant for her, writing letters to a ghost. It was not the life they had planned. It was not the life they had imagined when they were young and full of hope. But it was theirs, hard-won and precious, and Wendra would not trade it for anything. The years that followed were good ones, full and rich in ways that Wendra had not dared to hope for. Meryl grew into a bright, curious child, always underfoot at the mill, asking endless questions about how the wheel worked and why the grain had to be ground just so. Kellen was endlessly patient with her, explaining things in careful detail, and Wendra watched them together with a warmth in her chest that felt almost painful in its intensity. Farah and her family visited more often, and the initial awkwardness faded into genuine affection. Wendra's grandchildren adored Meryl, treating her like a little sister, and Farah softened toward Kellen, seeing the way he cared for Wendra and the child they had taken in. Jory and Micken remained steady presences, stopping by when they were in the area, always willing to lend a hand with repairs or help with the heavier work. The mill became known not just as a place to grind grain, but as a place of warmth and welcome. Travelers passing through would stop for a meal and a kind word, and Wendra found that she liked the rhythm of it, the steady stream of people and stories. She and Kellen hosted gatherings in the summer, inviting the neighboring farmers for meals and music, and the clearing would fill with laughter and light. One autumn evening, when Meryl was 3 years old, Wendra and Kellen sat on the porch after the child had gone to bed, wrapped in blankets against the chill. The leaves were turning, the forest ablaze with color, and the air smelled of wood smoke and approaching winter. "Do you ever think about what might have been?" Kellen asked, his voice quiet. "If that letter had reached you when it was supposed to?" Wendra considered the question carefully. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But then I think about my children, about Farah and Jory and Micken, and I cannot wish them away. They are part of my life, part of who I am. If the letter had reached me, they would not exist." Kellen nodded slowly. "I thought the same thing about Meryl. If everything had gone the way we planned, we would not have her, and I cannot imagine that. So maybe it happened the way it was supposed to," Wendra said. "Maybe we had to live those 20 years apart so that we could end up here, with the people we love, with a life that is richer than we could have imagined." "Maybe," Kellen agreed, though he sounded uncertain. Wendra reached over and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "We cannot change the past. We can only make the most of the time we have now, and I intend to make the most of it." He squeezed her hand, a small smile tugging at his lips. "So do I." They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars come out, and Wendra felt a deep sense of peace. The life they had built was not perfect, but it was theirs, and that was enough. As the years passed, Meryl grew into a lively, strong-willed child with Kellen's gray eyes and Wendra's determination. She was curious about everything, always exploring the forest or helping at the mill. And she had an uncanny ability to charm even the gruffest of the farmers who came by. Wendra and Kellen raised her with love and patience, teaching her the skills she would need to navigate the world as someone who did not quite fit into any one category. She was neither fully orc nor fully human, raised by both but belonging entirely to herself. When Meryl was 5, Maris returned for a brief visit, and Wendra saw the conflict in the young woman's eyes when she looked at her daughter. Maris had rebuilt her life, found work in a distant town, and she was doing well, but she had not come back for Meryl. She thanked Wendra and Kellen for everything they had done, pressed a kiss to Meryl's forehead, and left again, and Wendra knew that they would not see her again. Meryl was theirs now, fully and completely. Wendra's hair went fully silver, and Kellen's moved toward the same, and they settled into the comfortable rhythms of a long marriage. They bickered occasionally, usually about small things like how much wood to cut for the winter or whether the gardens needed more compost, but the arguments were never serious. They knew each other too well, loved each other too deeply, for the small irritations to matter. One spring morning, when Meryl was 7, Wendra woke to find Kellen already up and outside, working in the garden. She dressed and went to join him, finding him kneeling among the freshly turned earth, his hands dark with soil. He looked up when he heard her approach and smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling. "I was thinking we should plant more carrots this year," he said. "Meryl loves them." Wendra knelt beside him, taking up a trowel. "More carrots it is." They worked side by side, planting seeds and talking about nothing in particular, and Wendra felt the same sense of contentment she always felt when they worked together. This was what they had waited for, this simple, quiet partnership, and it was worth every moment of the waiting. As Meryl grew older, she began to ask questions about her origins, about her mother and where she had come from. Wendra and Kellen answered as honestly as they could, explaining that Maris had loved her but had not been able to care for her, and that they had been honored to raise her as their own. Meryl accepted this with the resilience of a child, and if she grieved for the mother she barely remembered, she did it quietly and without resentment. Wendra's children visited regularly, and the family gatherings at the mill became a cherished tradition. Farah's eldest daughter, a serious girl named Colleen, took a particular liking to Meryl, and the two girls would spend hours playing by the river or helping at the mill. Jory and Micken's children were rowdier, always getting into mischief, but they adored Wendra and Kellen and treated them with a respect that made Wendra's heart swell. One summer, when Meryl was 10, the family gathered for a celebration of Kellen's 65th birthday. The clearing around the mill was filled with people, children running and shouting, adults talking and laughing, and Wendra stood at the center of it all, feeling overwhelmed with gratitude. This was her family, cobbled together from loss and chance and stubborn love, and it was more than she had ever thought she would have. Farah found her standing alone near the garden and came over, slipping an arm around Wendra's waist. "You did well, Mother," she said quietly. "This is a good life you have built." Wendra leaned into her daughter, blinking back tears. "Thank you," she said. "That means more to me than you know." As the sun set and the party wound down, Kellen pulled Wendra aside, leading her down to the river. They stood at the water's edge, the sound of the current soothing, and he took both of her hands in his. "I have something to say," he began, and Wendra braced herself, unsure what was coming. "I have been thinking a lot lately about the letter, about the 20 years we lost. And I realized something. I do not wish we had gotten those years back, not anymore." Wendra frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean that if we had gotten those years, we would have missed out on so much. You would not have had your children. We would not have Meryl. We would not have learned the things we learned, grown the way we grew. We would have been different people, living a different life." He squeezed her hands. "I am grateful for the life we have, Wendra. I am grateful for every single moment, even the painful ones, because they led us here." Wendra felt tears spill over, running hot down her cheeks. "I feel the same way," she whispered. "I used to be so angry about the lost time, but now I just feel grateful for the time we have." Kellen pulled her into a hug, and they stood there by the river, holding each other as the stars came out overhead. It was a moment of perfect clarity, of understanding that the life they had was not in spite of the lost years, but because of them. The seasons turned, and the mill continued to run smoothly. Meryl grew into a capable young woman, strong and smart, with a gift for working with her hands. She took over more of the mill's operations as Wendra and Kellen slowed down, and she did it with a competence that made them both proud. She was courted by a young man from one of the neighboring farms, a kind, steady boy named Ethan who treated her with respect and affection. And Wendra and Kellen gave their blessing when he asked to marry her. Meryl's wedding was held at the mill, just as Wendra and Kellen's had been, and it was a joyful, chaotic affair with the clearing packed full of people. Wendra stood beside Kellen, watching their daughter exchange vows, and she felt a deep sense of completion. This was what they had built, this family, this community, and it would continue long after they were gone. As Wendra entered her 60s, she found that her body no longer cooperated the way it once had. Her joints ached, especially in the cold, and the heavy work of the mill became more difficult. Kellen was the same, his hands stiff and his back prone to spasms, and they relied more and more on Meryl and Ethan to keep things running. But they did not mind. They had earned their rest, and they took it gladly, spending their days tending the small kitchen garden or sitting by the river, watching the water flow past. One winter evening, when the snow lay thick on the ground and the mill was warm and quiet, Wendra and Kellen sat by the fire with mugs of mulled cider in their hands. Meryl and Ethan had gone to visit his family, leaving the mill peaceful and still, and Wendra felt a deep contentment settle over her. "You remember the first time we met?" Kellen asked, his voice soft. "You were hauling water from the well in the village square, and I offered to help." You told me you did not need help from anyone, especially not a human." Wendra laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. "I was stubborn. I did not want to owe anyone anything." "You were proud," Kellen corrected. "And rightly so, but I was persistent. I kept finding excuses to talk to you, to be near you, until finally you agreed to meet me by the old oak tree." "And you brought flowers," Wendra said, smiling at the memory. "Wildflowers you had picked yourself. I thought it was ridiculous, but I also thought it was sweet. I was trying to impress you." "You did." She set down her mug and reached over to take his hand. "You always did." They sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling, and Wendra thought about all the years they had spent together, the struggles and the joys, the losses and the gains. It had not been an easy life, but it had been a good one, and she would not change a single moment of it. As winter turned to spring and the world began to thaw, Wendra felt her strength waning. She did not say anything to Kellen or Meryl, not wanting to worry them, but she knew that her time was growing short. She had lived a full life, longer than she had expected, and she was ready for whatever came next. One morning in early spring, she woke to find Kellen already up, standing at the window and looking out at the garden. She joined him, slipping her hand into his, and they stood together in the pale morning light. "It is a beautiful day," Kellen said. "It is," Wendra agreed. He turned to her, his expression serious. "I want you to know that loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life. Even with the lost years, even with all the pain and uncertainty, I would do it all again in a heartbeat." Wendra felt tears prick her eyes, and she reached up to cup his face, her thumb brushing over his cheekbone. "I love you, Kellen Ashford. I have loved you since I was 22 years old, and I will love you until my last breath." He kissed her then, soft and lingering, and they stood there in the morning light, two people who had waited a lifetime to be together and had made every moment count. Wendra passed away peacefully in her sleep a few weeks later, with Kellen holding her hand. She slipped away quietly, without pain or fear, and Kellen sat with her for a long time afterward, whispering words of love and gratitude that she could no longer hear. Her funeral was held at the mill, and it seemed like the entire district came to pay their respects. Farah and Jory and Micken stood together, grieving their mother, and Meryl clung to Ethan, her face streaked with tears. Kellen stood at the center of it all, his expression calm and distant, and when it was his turn to speak, he told the gathered crowd about the letter that had arrived 20 years late, about the life he and Wendra had built together despite the lost time. "She was the love of my life," he said simply, "and I am grateful for every single day I got to spend with her." After the funeral, Kellen continued to run the mill with Meryl and Ethan's help, though his heart was no longer in it. He tended the gardens mechanically, ground the grain when it was brought to him, but the joy had gone out of the work. He spent long hours sitting by the river, staring at the water, and Meryl worried about him constantly. One evening, she sat down beside him and took his hand. "She would not want you to give up," Meryl said gently. "She would want you to keep going, to keep living." Kellen looked at his daughter, at the young woman who had brought so much light into his and Wendra's lives, and he managed a small smile. "I know, and I will. But I need time to grieve, Meryl. I need time to figure out how to live without her." "Take all the time you need," Meryl said, squeezing his hand. "We will be here." Kellen did take time, and slowly, gradually, the sharp edge of his grief dulled into something more manageable. He began to engage with the mill again, to take pleasure in the work and the rhythm of the days. He told stories about Wendra to anyone who would listen, keeping her memory alive, and he found comfort in the knowledge that she had been happy, that they had both been happy. Years passed, and Kellen grew older and frailer, but he remained at the mill, surrounded by family and friends. Meryl and Ethan had children of their own, and the mill was once again filled with the sound of young voices and laughter. Kellen became a beloved grandfather figure, always ready with a story or a piece of advice, and he found a quiet contentment in watching the next generation grow. One spring morning, when the gardens were in full bloom and the river was high with snowmelt, Kellen woke to the sound of birdsong and the smell of fresh earth. He rose slowly, his body protesting, and made his way outside. The clearing was beautiful, bathed in golden light, and he stood for a moment, taking it all in. He thought about Wendra, about the life they had shared, and he felt her presence like a whisper on the wind. She was gone, but she was also still here, in the gardens they had planted, in the mill they had restored, in the family they had built. She was woven into every part of this place, and that was enough. Kellen lived for another 3 years, long enough to see Meryl's eldest child start helping at the mill, long enough to know that the legacy he and Wendra had created would continue. When he finally passed, it was peacefully in his sleep, and Meryl found him the next morning with a faint smile on his face. They buried him beside Wendra, in a quiet spot near the river, and the entire district came to mourn and celebrate the man who had waited 20 years for the woman he loved, and had built a life with her that was worth every moment of the waiting. Meryl stood at the graveside, her own children beside her, and she thought about the story of the letter, about the love that had refused to be extinguished despite time and distance and loss. It was a story she would tell her children and grandchildren, a story about patience and faith and the enduring power of love. The mill continued to run, passed down through the generations, and the gardens bloomed every spring, a testament to the life that Wendra and Kellen had built together. Their story became a part of the fabric of the district, a reminder that love could survive anything, even 20 years of separation, and that it was never too late to find your way home.